I want to turn to our very special guest. Diana Henriques is a longtime reporter for the New York Times for more than 25 years on staff, and now is a contributing writer. She's been one of the best investigative reporters in the game. She's been a Pulitzer finalist twice as either an individual or a member of a team, and she's won the Gerald Loeb Award, the top award in business writing, for covering the near collapse of long-term capital management. It was a hedge fund, and it was a very big story for the younger reporters in the crowd back in the late 90s. That was like one of the biggest business stories at the time. She's won several other awards, and we have the full list of them on the bio that you've all been provided. She's also the author of several books. Her most recent is A First-Class Catastrophe: The Road to Black Monday, the worst day in Wall Street history for you youngins. That's also another big day in history back in 1987. When the stock market crashed. I believe it was 22% in one day. And she is the author of The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust. It was turned into an HBO film with Robert De Niro as Madoff and Diana Henriques as Diana Henriques. She actually had a role in the film, coming to interview the Robert De Niro, Bernie Madoff character in prison. So if you have, you can watch that on HBO. It's a great book. I read it a couple of years ago and watched the HBO film right after that. I've asked Diana to come talk about investigative reporting and the burden of proof. I mean, how do you know when you have what you think you have? How will you, what's the level of evidence you need for a story that's going to convince your readers, convince the subject and the people you're writing about, keep you out of trouble, and be interesting and readable, because these are all, particularly in the business front, very complex topics. And welcome, Diana. I'll turn it over to you right now.
Thanks so much. I'm jealous of all the wonderful folks you have coming to see you, especially Rob Wells this afternoon and my old friend Jim Steele, who will be just a terrific experience for you. I want to dive right in because we don't have a lot of time. I usually do this workshop in 90 minutes or so, so we're going to do a fast force march through it. These are techniques that I developed when I was a beat reporter trying to do enterprise reporting around the edges of my daily courthouse responsibilities. And it's a technique that I have used consistently through a quarter century on everything from Sunday enterprise stories to books that I'm working on now. So I'm sharing it with you as a potential tool for you. I encourage you to tinker with it to suit your own methods, because it's very much designed for the way that I work. But the goal here is to think analytically, to plan in advance as you approach an enterprise effort, whether it's a story or a production, and to anticipate where things can go wrong. So I call this getting the story and telling the story, and we're going to start with getting the story. Now, to get the story, first, of course, you have to see a story. And the way I've come to think about this is to apply the scientific method in a kind of journalistic application. And that means I try to frame a working hypothesis for what I'm trying to prove. Now that I frame it as a statement. Some folks have adapted this to make it a question. What can I prove? What am I trying to prove here? But either way, whether it's a statement or a question, what you're doing is trying to pull on the reporting that you've done that's led you to think you've got a bigger story than a breaking news story here, that you've got an enterprise project. Pull on that and figure out where you think the evidence available to you now is leading, and develop a working hypothesis for what this story could prove if you can muster the facts. So that's step one. Frame a working hypothesis for your project. Step two, assess your existing knowledge that can help you prove that project. This is a step we never really give ourselves enough time to explore. You don't approach a story ice cold. You have, all of you are distinguished journalists. You wouldn't be here in this group if you weren't. You bring a lot of resources to a project. Maybe it's a topic you haven't studied before. Maybe you're getting into tax areas and you've never done that before, but you know how to develop sources. You probably have sources on the fringes of these stories. What I do when I when I'm working on a new project, I actually make a list of everybody I know, everything I'm already familiar with that will help me do that story. That gives me a sense of what resources I'm bringing to the table. Then step 3, analyze what you will need to know to prove your hypothesis. Now, this can be a tricky process. I was working with a group of former Eastern European journalists in the days of their new democracies who came to the US under the State Department aegis. And we were going through this process. One of the journalists from Krakow said, well, I've got this project and my editor won't let me pursue it. Well, what's the project? Well, he had noticed that the brand new mutual fund industry in Poland had mutual fund managers who were all buying stocks from a particular underwriting house that turned into dogs. They went to zero, they circled the drain, they lost money. And he was convinced that they were being bribed by those stocks. Well, I walked him through, what would you need to know to prove they were being bribed? Now, feel free to chip in here. What would you have to prove that money fund manager or mutual fund managers were being bribed to buy dodgy stocks from an underwriting house? Well, obviously you'd have, video would be good, right? Some kind of, the bag man handing the cash over, that would be nice. Bank records would be good, showing unexplained supplies of cash hitting the records. Documentation of a standard of living that's different from what their probably not public salary is. So you start looking at what you need to know, and you realize the surpassing difficulty of getting it. And at that point, you say, you can't get that story. You need subpoenas to get that story. You need handcuffs to get that story. You can't get that story. But is there a story in there that you can get? And we talked it through, and indeed there was. And the bonus to that is you write a story about, gee, why are all these money market funds buying these dodgy stocks from this one underwriter? Look at the track record of that. Maybe somebody picks up the phone and calls, gives you the tip that can send you into the deeper story. But he had failed to write that story for nearly a year because he had not analyzed the difficulty of getting the story he believed was there. So that's the exercise in part 3. Analyze what you would need to know, what you would need to have, what you would need to prove to bring that thesis home, to carry that thesis across the line. And then the 4th step, and I can tell you from judging 25 years of press contents, this is the step almost nobody ever takes, okay? And that is answer the so what question. You prove your thesis. You got it down, you nailed it, bulletproof. So what? Why does it matter that you've proved that? What is the public stake in that issue? What will make the readers glom on, your editor's eyes laid up? Why does that story matter? And if you don't have a clear idea of that you can write out in a sentence at the bottom of the page, then you need to go back and do some more work. I had an experience once, oldsters here may remember, when the Bill Clinton campaign was exposed in a novel called Primary Colors. And Primary Colors had been written by Anonymous, right? Well, an editor at the Times, who shall go nameless, decided that we should find out who Anonymous was. And that, more specifically, I should find out who Anonymous was. Well, I did this exercise with him. I said, okay, your working hypothesis is what? That whoever wrote this novel was someone who violated a trust with the campaign who had somehow crossed some kind of ethical line by writing this novel, or someone we would all be interested in knowing the identity of. That's the working hypothesis. What we already know at that point was nothing. I knew the name of the agent that had represented the book, and I knew the name of the publisher, period. What would we need to know? Well, obviously, you'd have to have some kind of proof, even if you confronted an author with the allegation that they were the author of Primary Colors, they'd have to either agree or not. And if they denied it, what were you going to do? You would need the contract. You would need to have somebody to pass you some documentation from within the publishing house that would prove that even in the face of a denial, this was the author. Then we got to the fourth point. So what? So I prove who it is. So what? Why would it matter to anybody except 12 journalists in New York? And that was what put the stake in the heart of this story, because I was able to show how much work was going to be involved. The balance between what we knew and what we would need to know was so disproportionate that it was going to be a huge amount of work for itty bitty payback, itty bitty thing that nobody was really going to care about. So that's why this analysis process can be so useful. Now, a word of caution: a hypothesis is not a label. It is not a topic. It is a statement of what you think you can prove. Now, it's not carved in stone. As you learn more, as you gain more sources, get more information, you will undoubtedly go in and revise that thesis. You may even go in and say, I was wrong. Never mind. This thesis cannot be proved because it's not true. You have to be prepared to go where the evidence leads you, but you start out with a destination in mind. And if events require you to change that destination, you do so. But what you do not do is say, I'm going to write a story about taxes. My hypothesis is taxes. Please don't. This is what gives investigative editors the willies. This is when investigative reporters disappear into the swamp and never come back again. They don't have a destination in mind. They have a topic. And you can find information about that topic under every bush, but you don't know what you're trying to prove, so you don't know how much of that information is useful, and you pick it all up and bring it home. Don't do that. So a hypothesis is a statement of what you want to prove, and that will be the thumbnail description of that story throughout the newsroom and throughout the publication distribution process. The knowledge you already have, that builds your source list, that gives you an idea of how big the gap is between what you need to know and what you already know. What you need to learn is your to-do list, obviously. That becomes I got to find this, I got to find that, I got to figure out who knows this, I got to get in touch with them. What's their phone number? I've got to find their phone number. Detailed steps that you can come back to in any spare moment and click one or two off.
And Diana, could I just, sorry to interrupt, but I just want to do a quick poll of our fellows who skew younger. How many people know who wrote Primary Colors? Do you know the resolution to this story? Well, Diana, tell them who wrote it, because that actually shows that you were right and your editor was wrong.
It was written by Joe Klein, who was a columnist for Newsweek.
So and not an insider or anything
not
like
an
that.
Insider. There were no ethical violations involved whatsoever. And by the way, how was it discovered? Chris will remember this too. It was discovered not by some enterprising journalist who had more guts than I did. It was discovered by a software analysis guru, a guy who had developed software that allowed him to analyze writing and compare it to other samples of writing. And he found that the text of Primary Colors most closely resembled Joe Klein's writing. And that's how the story was solved. So yeah, it would have been a total and elaborate waste of my time, which I was able to avoid by tackling the so what issue. That was, I mean, part of what sold my position was the huge gap between what we already knew and what we would have to write a bulletproof story. That gap gives you a very clear idea of how long. What's the first question the editor asks about a project? How long, right? How long will it take? How long do you need, right? You can't answer that question unless you've done this analysis, unless you've done the analysis between how much you already know and what you will need to know to write this bulletproof story. The gap between those two is how long it will take you to get this story, roughly. You know, bigger than a bread box, smaller than a battleship. It gives you some idea of the order of magnitude of the effort.
Do you think that same process would have occurred today in this age of Twitter and Facebook? Do you think a reporter in that situation now would have faced ultimately more pressure to pursue that story?
Oh, probably, but that's no excuse. You know, your most precious resource, Twitter notwithstanding, is time. Social media has not changed how many hours there are in a day. It never will. Your most precious resource as a writer, as a human being, is time. What are you going to spend your time on? And all Twitter and social media does is add to the gaggle of people trying to waste your time. So it might make it more difficult, but it makes it even more necessary that you have a clear idea of how you're going to most efficiently use your investigative time. That's really the reason I came up with this method. Was I was under immense pressure to try to squeeze investigative stories into a very busy beat. I was a county courthouse reporter. You know, there were trials going on. There were motion days every Tuesday. There were indictments every Thursday. So it was a busy beat, but I wanted to do enterprise reporting. And this was a way I found that I could do that. Just to move on, the so what question will ultimately become your nut graph, okay? So your hypothesis becomes the topic of your story. Your knowledge that you already have becomes your daily source list, and you'll build that out as you report. What you need to learn becomes your to-do list, and you mince it fine and click it off as quickly as you can. And the so what answer yields your nut graph. It lights the fire in your editor's eyes, and it grabs your readers and doesn't let go if you've done it right. So that's the scientific method for framing an investigative project or an enterprise project. Any questions about that before I move on to the next part?
Rachel had a question in chat. Rachel, you just want to ask it verbally?
Rachel Riley with the Everett Daily Herald. You just mentioned that, you know, time is obviously a very precious resource for all of us, especially us at smaller newspapers with breaking news and responsibilities. What questions do you ask when you're trying to determine what story ideas are most worthy of your time and have the most potential to be public service?
Well, it really boils down to that. So what? Why should people care? And it's important to understand. I mean, and you might have a vague idea that people will get excited or concerned or outraged or passionate about a topic that you're looking at. But until you actually write out why people should care, you're not really on solid ground that you actually have it. For example, and it's a dynamic answer. In other words, the answer changes over time with the events in the news, as you obviously know. The story we're going to focus on a little bit later, the Captive Clientele series, which I'm proud to say won a Polk Award and was one of my 2 Pulitzer finalists, was a study of financial ripoffs of military consumers. Service members who were being ripped off by life insurance salesmen and mutual fund salesmen. Now, a tiny piece of that story, that is the sale of contractual plan life insurance products, had surfaced 3 or 4 years before I first got the tip about it in a short, like 12, 13-inch story in the Wall Street Journal that had dropped like a stone down a well. It had made absolutely no impact whatsoever. I get a tip about the same mutual fund sales continuing to be sold. And at that point, we're sending kids to Iraq. The circumstances had changed. Maybe people were willing to brush off rip-offs of military consumers, say, oh, well, they should know better. They should look out for themselves. Being in the military is no excuse for not managing your personal finances. But when you are doing an up-tempo deployment of military personnel to a war zone, the public's attitudes about that changes. And so the answer to why will people care became, we're asking these kids to give their lives, their health, their futures to this country, and we're ripping them off before we send them over? I don't think so. So the moral outrage that I knew the public would feel about those abuses became the so what answer. So, and that's the kind of analysis that you need to go through here. Is that helpful, Rachel? Yeah. Okay, good. Other questions about this before we move on? I'm just looking over here in the chats to see.
Looks like we have one from Isabel.
Yes, as you go through the reporting process and revise, how to decide when you're ready to publish rather than waiting to try to get closer. Let me save that for the next portion, for the portion about telling the story, okay? Because it weaves in into that dynamic. When you know you're ready to publish is part of the process of getting the story told. So let me hold that. Remind me, Isabel, wherever you are on the grid here, that I wanted to circle back to that specific point. Okay, one other aspect of getting the story, obviously planning the story is job one. If you take nothing else out of this workshop, plan. I mean, I'll use all the corporate buzz speak. A failure to plan is planning to fail, all of that crap. It is true. It is absolutely true. If you do not plan an enterprise project carefully up front, you will waste your time. And what did I say about time? None of us get any more of that. So that would be a sin against journalism. So that's planning the story. Now, getting the story. You're all great reporters. You don't need me to tell you how to report, but you might need me to tell you how to report so that you can tell a great story later on. And that's what I'm going to mention here. I say in my outline, report with all 5 senses. And I know in the pandemic period, one of the most frustrating aspects of being a reporter here was you had to do everything like this. All of you are sitting in settings that I can see behind you, but what's the wonderful smell in that kitchen behind you? What's the bird song coming through that window I see behind you? What are those plaques and artwork on the walls behind you, Nick? I mean, if I were there, I would be picking up all of that detail. Why does Alex have signal flags, nautical signal flags behind him? Is he a sailor? Is he? So when you're able to report in person, you can use all 5 senses. What does it smell like? What does it sound like? What does it look like? What does it feel like in the office, the whole atmosphere? You start to be able to pull all of those impressions together and use it for storytelling. Now, here's the trick. You better do that when you first go out, because you can't circle back. One of the silliest things I ever saw was it was an essay that ran in a journalism magazine that shall go nameless, but the idea was was from an editor who said, well, they bring me in at the end to do the writing. And I say, good luck with that, because if the reporters didn't bring back the straw you're going to need to make those bricks, you're out of luck. If they didn't bring back the information that will allow you to bring that story to life the way a screenwriter brings a story to life, You can't go out and do it ex post facto. You can't do it after the fact. So be sure you report with all of your senses. Be sure you think of the people in your story as characters with a backstory and that you know it. You know where these characters came from. They don't just pop up on the stage in the middle of the story. You know what brought them into that story, and you can make them fully realized three-dimensional characters. Great scenes in a story are built from great details, and you better gather those details while you're reporting, or you will not have what you need to make the story readable at the end. Okay, moving on to telling the story here. This is the essence of what I know you're going to be grappling with in the stories you're going to be working on out of this, this fellowship. And so I wanted to spend time here. Facts are there to meet your burden of proof. That is to prove your hypothesis. And you need to have the facts necessary to prove your hypothesis. Just enough facts. So the length of a story is determined by the burden of proof that your thesis requires. And you must use enough facts to prove your thesis and not one fact more. My editor at Barron's, Alan Abelson, one of the great business editors of all time, used to say, and I was especially guilty of this because of all our reporter insecurities, you know, have I proven it yet? Have I proven it yet? And he would come into the office, my office at Barron's, and say, Diana, once you've hung him and shot him and stabbed him, you don't have to poison him and drown him too. You just need to kill him once, okay? So what we tend to do is pile on facts long after we've met our burden of proof at the expense of telling the story. You've got a finite amount of space. How much of it are you going to use to prove your case, and how much of it are you going to use to tell your story? And that's what we're talking about in terms of finding the right balance in this burden of proof. Don't overprove your point. When you've got it proven, look for the storytelling elements that you can add. Now, the flip side of this is, if you need to cut a story, what do? Well, the easy solution is take out all the storytelling elements, leave in all the bulletproof points, right? No, please don't do that. I'm going to turn you now to the exercise that the exhibit I postponed. And if I can do this right, I'll do a screen share. There it is. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yep, it's up now.
Okay. So this was the thesis of that military financial abuse story I mentioned. The URL is given there, and you have this paper in your hand. So if you want to pursue the whole story, you can. But the thesis was, as laid out here, several financial service companies or their agents were using questionable tactics on military bases to sell life insurance and investments that may not fit the needs of people in uniform. The Pentagon had been aware of these practices since the Vietnam War, but because of industry lobbying, congressional pressure, weak enforcement, and the Pentagon's ineffective oversight, no action had been taken to address the abuses. Now, okay, so this is the big project. I had a 3-part series. Editor comes along and says, no. It's got to be a 2-part series. We can't do it any longer than that. I have to cut. So let's go through what I could do. To cut the story, I could save my evidence about investment abuses for a separate story. And then the thesis would become, as I've outlined here, questionable practices to sell life insurance. Now that eliminates a whole bunch of stuff in the story that's related to mutual funds. All the examples I have of mutual fund ripoffs, those go into a separate story. Or I could eliminate the reference to the Pentagon's prior knowledge of these abuses, saving that. So the thesis would be as here. abusive sales that may not fit the needs of the people, but because of industry lobbying, congressional pressure, et cetera, no action had been taken. My third option, obviously, is telegraphed there. I could cut out the reasons for inaction and save those for a separate story or an analysis piece. Okay, so I'll just say no action had been taken, even though they've known about these practices for a long time. But here's the bottom line here. The minimum length of a story that a story needs to be is determined by your burden of proof, not the whim of your editor. And to cut that story, you must scale back what you're trying to prove. You must scale back your burden of proof. To do anything else is going to leave you with one of two results. A bulletproof story that no one but your mother will read, or a readable, engaging story that leaves some of its thesis unproven, which the lawyers for those affected will love. So it's important that you think about the length of a story in terms of the size of your burden of proof. Is that clear? I want to stop for questions now because this is so critical. And let me just see if anything has come in. Okay, now I want to go, before that, let me circle back to Isabel's question. Isabel, this is what I'm talking about. You asked, when are you ready to write? You're ready to write when you have enough evidence to prove whatever piece of your burden of proof you want to select. Now, just to walk you through the analysis that I did with my editor on the military abuses story. The first tip we got dealt with mutual funds, the sale of inappropriate mutual funds that were so bad they weren't even being sold in the civilian market anymore. They were only being sold to military people because they were being sold through a bizarre chain of command glory system that was just perverse. Well, when I got that tip, I was really thrilled because I literally had written the book on mutual funds. I had written the book of the American history of mutual funds called Fidelity's World. There wasn't anything about contractual plan mutual funds that I did not know. And I say that with all due modesty. I knew every regulator in the mutual fund industry. I knew the history of every firm that was selling these funds. I knew how many scandals they'd been involved in the past. I was home free. All I needed to learn was about the military world, the military market for these funds. So the gap between what I already knew over here and what I needed to know was fairly small. I go to my editor, I said, 3-4 weeks, I think, at most. He said, great, good, go for it. So digging into the mutual fund story, I stumble across a report from a retired Army judge who was doing an investigation about abusive life insurance practices. It literally was in a footnote to a document that I had printed out, and I tracked it down. And the life insurance abuses were even more prevalent, even more horrifying, even more abusive than anything else. But here's the problem. I didn't know nothing about life insurance. I'd never covered it. I knew it was regulated at the state level, not the federal level. That was about as much as I knew about how it was regulated. I was a little vague about the difference between cash value life insurance and term life insurance. Didn't know anything. So all of a sudden, the gap between what I already knew and what I was going to need to know shifted in the opposite direction in a massive way. I go back to the editor. What are we going to do? And at that point, Isabel, the choice was break off the mutual fund piece. I can do that quickly. I can get it in print quickly, and then take more time with the life insurance piece. Ultimately, that wasn't my call. The editor said, no, it will have more impact if you combine it together and do it that way. So there's no right call to this. It's when are you ready to publish a piece of it is when you have your burden of proof met and enough storytelling elements that you can do a decent job telling that story. But is there more to learn in the story? There may be. At that point, it becomes a judgment call that you will work out with your editor. In the back of your mind, you should keep in making that judgment call, what will maximize the impact of this story with my reader. And I knew, because the elements of the life insurance abuses were so heartrending. I mean, these were kids that were making $1,100 a month, spending $100 a month in insurance premiums for a life insurance policy that would pay $28,000 if they were killed, while every single one of them already had military insurance that, if they were killed, paid $250,000 for $18 a month. So there was absolutely no excuse whatsoever for selling this life insurance. So I knew that had the biggest outrage factor, right? So that will be some of the issues that you'll take into effect when you're trying to decide when you're ready to roll and when you're not. Any other questions about the burden of proof balance, the balancing act here?
Bridget, why don't you just ask it verbally, and everybody tell Diana where you're from when you introduce yourselves.
Sure. Hi, Diana. I'm Bridget Bowman. I work for CQ Roll Call.
Sure.
I was just curious, in the example that you shared of having to kind of scale back the hypothesis, how did you decide which part to let go or which part to scale back?
Well, in consultation, really, with the editor, we scaled back the reasons for Pentagon inaction, in part because some of them sounded dated. They related to studies that had been done in years and years before. And the editor felt that stepping back into that morass of why hadn't the Pentagon done anything was slowing us down and reducing the immediacy of the story. So we scaled back that. As it happened, I got a tip when the stories ran. And by the way, it made a huge impact. It almost shut down our email system the day the story ran. Now, this was back in the back in the 80s, 2004. So our email system wasn't as remote as robust as it is now, but I had a huge impact. Congressional hearings were held, all of that stuff. And I got a tip from somebody saying, telling me about an experience he had with the Air Force attempting to crack down on these abuses and all the shenanigans that went on to protect the abusers in that situation. So I dug into that. It became a great follow-up freestanding story that allowed me to pull back in some of that earlier data. But I think it's a kind of a triage. What can I take out that will have the least effect on the public's reaction to the story? Okay. What was the response from the Pentagon to the stories? Well, all of that's in the history records, so I'm not going to take our time. Actually, the Pentagon was thrilled with the story because they had been trying. The serious people in the Defense Department have been trying to address this problem for decades. And what had stopped them was the political power of these insurance companies. And overnight, that story made it a kiss of death for any politician to be taking money from those companies. So their power as campaign donors evaporated overnight. In fact, there was a race going on in Texas at that moment where the adversary to the guy in office used the fact that he had taken money from these life insurance companies in the campaign against him. So that was, they suddenly found that one of the biggest obstacles to them addressing this had been neutralized. The JAG Corps, I'm pleased to say, actually gave me an award. The Army JAG Corps gave me an award for having done this. And I told them in return, eternal vigilance is the price of keeping this situation under control. It has flared up and eased back. It remains a topic everybody should keep their eyes on. Jessica Silver Greenberg at the New York Times 10 years later did a follow-up series of stories showing that some of the abuses were creeping back in. So, that was the response.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm David Cruz. I'm with Gothmas and WNYC. I was wondering, when is it decided that a story will need to be looked at by, say, like an attorney, lawyer, just to kind of button the story up?
You know, that's going to be unique to your organization. At the Times, that wasn't a question. At the Times, every story that had any enterprise elements to it was reviewed. A reporter could could ask that it be reviewed, but almost always an editor was going to send it to legal review. In fact, Adam Liptak was originally, who now covers the Supreme Court for the New York Times, started his career at the New York Times as a lawyer on our general counsel staff, reviewing our stories. And we always loved to have Adam review it because he was the best editor we could get. He not only made sure it was bulletproof, he made it sound better. So then he shifted into reporting. And David McCraw took on that chore. You should be eager for legal review. You should absolutely be eager for it. It's your best friend. It can be a simple change in a structure of a sentence that can save you from unnecessary agita and angst. So at the Times, it's a policy call, and it's almost, it's impossible to get any sort of enterprise, anything other than a breaking news story. It's almost impossible to get it published without a legal review. And I think that's a good practice.
Hey, Emily had a question. And then we'll go to Emily and then Caitlin.
Yeah, hi, Emily Wilkins with Bloomberg Government. Because we're a subscription-based service, we don't tend to get a whole lot of tips. And I just wanted to see sort of what your thoughts are on sort of the best way to find story ideas that are ripe for investigation. And because I feel like so often it's like, oh, that's interesting, but like it doesn't turn out to be like a big investigative story. I get to like step 2 or step 3.
Right. It doesn't have legs. Yeah, that, you know, I tackle this I hate to say this to Chris, I tackle this in a separate workshop, the investigative mindset, which I've worked up to work with journalists who are trying to figure out if a topic is a book topic or not. You know, is this a book project? It's likely that I could develop into that, but it's really kind of the same thought analysis. But it's a complex problem, and I'm sympathetic to the fact that you don't get a lot of tips, and that means that how you look at the stories you do see, or the stories that you normally cover, becomes even that more critical. And that investigative mindset is, you probably already have it, Emily. You just don't think about it as a discrete tool that you're bringing to bear on the process. Why is something so? I once was giving a class at New York University in their graduate school of journalism, and we were meeting in a classroom, and I said, okay, look around this room. There's an obvious question that I see here in this workroom, that just staring at all of us, and I want to know what you see. And you know, stumbled from it. I said, no. Look around you. Every computer in this room is an Apple product. Why? Why does Apple have all the computer business at New York University? So it's that kind of thing. You look at what is and you ask, why is it that way? Why isn't it different? You look at what has happened. Why did it happen that way? What were the forces that led to it happening that way? That's that approach. It's a lot of fun to explore that in great length, and I would love to do it, but I want to get to the storytelling aspects of this effort before we go too much further. I'm running at, I've had 10 minutes left, gang. So
Diana, we can go a little bit past.
Okay,
noon.
okay, good. I don't want to cut off good questions, and that is a good one, because we sometimes what you're seeing is the evidence of anomalies. It boils down to watching for anomalies and figuring out which of them are potentially important. During a market meltdown when I was at Barron's magazine, there was one little stock that on a day that every other stock in the market tumbled, didn't. It went up. Why? Well, it turned out it went up because it was being rigged by the underwriters. It was a manipulated stock. Well, that was important for Barron's because it loves those little tidbits. It wasn't a big story, but it was a cute little story for Barron's. Probably wouldn't have been important to the readers of the New York Times. They're not that much market mavens. It didn't affect the tenor of the market. That's the kind of noticing and then the evaluation. What anomaly is this, and why should this anomaly matter? Where might it lead me? I can't emphasize too much the need to develop your own tipster network. I mean, don't just wait for tips to come in. Reach out to see what people are hearing, what they're happening. Let them know you're interested, and then you may find a better string of stories. Okay, let me just look. Okay, moving on to telling the story. This is my real hobby horse, and that's why I'm glad we have a few more minutes for me to ride it for a bit. There have been gorgeous investigative projects done that have been produced in a form that is damn near unreadable. And that is such an incredible waste of time and resources and reader credibility. So if investigative reporters and explanatory journalists in general do not get better at storytelling, we might as well just hang up the old running shoes there, because it's going to be very hard to get people to focus on these stories. And I say that as a longtime judge of many, many, many press contests where a really dynamite discovery has been buried in absolutely unreadable prose. Don't be like that. In fact, I read a story like that quite recently in one of our major publications. I'm not going to trot it out, but reading through it, I almost had to make a list of all of the characters. I almost had to outline the story to make any sense of it at all, although I understood that somewhere in there was an important thesis. So crafting a coherent story, it's something you can practice. Now, starting out as a reporter, I was a fairly facile writer, had been since early high school. You give me 3 hours to do a story, I could reliably spend 2 hours and 45 minutes reporting it and 15 minutes writing some slapdash, pretty decent version of it that might get polished up a little bit by the editors, right? And on that skill set, I cruised through the first dozen years of my career. I regret that, because when I actually started to focus on writing better, I found that there were stories I had written years ago that I could have made better if I'd only spent more time on them. I could have given them more impact. I could have broadened their reach, made them more accessible. So don't be like me. Don't wait until 12 years, 20 years into your career to say, I really want to work on my writing. It is something you can learn. I always thought, it's a gift. I got it. I can turn out a facile inverted pyramid story. No big deal. But in fact, I wasn't a very good writer. I was an okay writer, but I wasn't a good writer. I wasn't a writer that could write a book that could get on the bestseller list, telling you something about a story the entire world already knew, the Bernie Madoff story. That took work. And I'm urging you to start doing that work now, okay? The universal truths of humankind are the bedrock for telling a good story. The Bernie Madoff story was, in effect, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, okay? If I say to Chris, my editor, Chris, I've got a really, really great Cinderella story for you. Chris doesn't have any doubt about what the shape of that story is going to be, do you? You know it's good. Yeah, it's going to be what? Cinderella story is going to be, you know, the little impoverished company that comes out of nowhere and discovers something that turns it into a princess, right? But you know, it's not a Cinderella story, Chris. I'm sorry. Actually, this is a David versus Goliath story. Anybody got any doubts what that story is going to be about? No, you all know. You're all nodding your head. Okay. Every merger story on the planet is a Romeo and Juliet story. Okay. Star-crossed lovers. Can these two families ever get along? Right. Or in some cases, the Hatfields and the McCoy story. But the point is that in stories that really have reach and really touch people, you can find the shape of one of these archetypal stories. One of the oldest instincts in our brains, going back to the campfires in the caves, was tell me a story. We are hardwired in the oral tradition. We are hardwired to hear stories. And a story that takes a recognizable shape instantly comforts us and allows us to settle down and enjoy the details. Now that seems counterintuitive. If I say it's a Cinderella story, you're going to say, well, God, I've heard every Cinderella. I've heard the Cinderella story. I don't need to know a new Cinderella story. But it doesn't work that way. You say, oh, good, a new Cinderella story. And you settle down to listen. So look in the stories that you're looking for traces of these archetypal stories. And by that, what do I mean? You can see the remnants of these archetypal stories in our literature, in our language, in our traditions, in our adages and sayings. The pot calling the kettle black, the hypocrisy story, right? A universal, the Icarus story. You know, how many, great downfall stories are simply Icarus told in a new way. So if you can educate yourself, first of all, about the full range of these archetypal stories and train your mind to look at the stories unfolding around you in that framework, you will then start finding answers to those questions about why will people care about this? What will trigger people for this? Okay. Things like I encourage you to read things like Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, anything or any précis of that, any discussion of it, the PBS series on it, which goes back years and years, but you can still find it online. But just to train your mind into thinking about what are these archetypal stories. I'm told, by the way, that there is a recognizable version of the Jack and the Beanstalk fairy tale in virtually every human culture on the planet. So even though we think some of these stories are unique to English literature, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or Robinson Crusoe, that's another great archetypal story, abandoned in an unfamiliar environment and trying to make your way. That is the Meghan Markle story, is it not? Yes, it is. So you start to see how those can be universal. And you harness them for your story. You can't torture the facts to turn it into one of these archetypal stories, but you need to watch for the signs that it's in there. And the stories that do include echoes of one of these archetypal human stories are the ones that are going to have legs for you. Now, learning from pot boilers and the silver screen as we finish up, you can learn how to tell a great story. You can learn screenwriting. And I learned that by working with the 3 screenwriters who developed the script for HBO's adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. One of the best experiences of my life. It was transformative for me as a writer to work with people who write screenplays for a living. They don't get, the director does not yell out lights, camera, explanation, right? Lights, camera, action. And you would be amazed how few of our stories include any action. Anything that could be converted into a scene in a movie where people actually do things. And yet it's that kind of scene that gives your story momentum, that pulls a reader along. So I've listed in the outline, so I don't have to go over them now, resources. These are my curated list. I've read a huge number of guides to writing screenplays, and these are the three I like best. Best among them is Chris Bogor's book, The Writer's Journey. It became a Bible for screenwriters in Hollywood until it almost became a cliche. But for us writers and scribblers out in the real world, it still is incredibly fresh and engaging. So take some time to invest in your own writing skills, and don't be afraid of looking at Hollywood as your instructor for that. And then finally, pacing is the last critical piece I wanted to deal with. I feel like we're racing along here, but speaking of pacing, I would have paced this workshop a little differently with more time. But how many of you, if you're writing a script for a production piece or a piece, how many of you read it aloud to yourself? I'm seeing a few hands going up. Okay, that's great. Keep doing that, but it's not enough. What reading your story aloud tells you is where it starts to flag, where the sentence gets too convoluted, it's got too many dependent clauses, you need to break it into 3 sentences. That's the important reason to keep doing that. It helps you make sure you have a consistent rhythm, pacing within the story, that you're not hitting stumbling blocks, potholes, obstacles, got a nice consistent pacing within the story. But how do you know it's the right pace? I had a scarifying experience with the opening of the new book I did, The First Class Catastrophe. It's a story about the road to the 1987 market crash. And I had debated about whether or not to open with the crash itself and then do a flashback. My editor and I had decided after several attempts that it was better to start the story where I wanted to start the story and build up to the 1987 crash. But when the page proofs arrived, I start with the early chapters and my heart just sinks. I said, oh my God, no one's ever going to stay with this story long enough to get to the crash. It's too slow. It's opening too slowly. So how do I speak? Well, first I called the editor in tears, caught him on the tarmac in Fort Lauderdale on his way to see his mother. And he says, okay, do whatever you need to change it. We'll just do we'll pull another set of proofs. A huge dispensation for which I was immensely grateful. But then what do? What I did, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit it, but it worked. So I'm going to tell you about it. I'm a big fan of Lee Child's Jack Reacher series of thrillers. Okay, now maybe Jack Reacher isn't your cup of tea. Maybe it's, I don't know, Tom Clancy, Jim Patterson, whoever, but I want someone who churns out genuine, verifiable page turners, can't put it down books, okay? For me, Lee Child. What I did, confronted with this frightening slowness at the beginning of this book, I pulled up a Lee Child novel on my Kindle, opened it to chapter 4. Do not open it at chapter 1 or you will not put it down. That's how he designed it, right? I just opened it at chapter 4 or 5 somewhere and started reading it out loud. And I would read 3 or 4 paragraphs of Jack Reacher, and then I would read 3 or 4 paragraphs of Diana Henriques and feel the difference in the pacing. And then I would start cutting and tightening and eliminating adjectives and shortening sentences and breaking up the complex thoughts until Diana Henriques was almost as fast as Jack Reacher. And then we'd move on. I'd read more Jack Reacher more Diana Henriques, went through the first 3 chapters of the book that way until I got to the point where the story itself picked up the momentum. And one of the book, I'm happy to say, received very great critical acclaim. It wasn't a bestseller, but it was the best book I've ever written, and the reviews reflected that. But in almost every review, it said page turner, can't put it down, whips along. It commented on the pacing. So that's the trick. Read it aloud for its internal pace, compare it to some verifiable page turning pace to speed up that internal pace until it approaches. Now, we've got facts we have to deal with. We cannot just ride roughshod over them the way a novelist can, but you can get closer. You can improve the pacing of your stories that way. Now, the rest of the time, and I have plenty of time to stay, the rest of the time is yours. I've whipped through my outline, which you have, and I will, oh, by the way, Chris knows how to reach me. I'd be happy to field email questions from any of you whom I haven't been able to get to. I'm just looking quickly at the questions. Do you dictate your notes or read them aloud? Not notes, no. Actually, it should be said, I dictate everything. I actually use voice recognition software to write because of carpal tunnel injury 25 years ago. So I use Dragon naturally speaking software, and I do all of my writing with dictation. So now, I think that might be part of why I was able to work on improving the conversational style of my writing. When you're dictating something and you're on the 3rd dependent clause of a sentence and you haven't said period yet, it's time to revise that sentence, and you realize it because you're out of breath. Okay, so that has helped a lot in terms of designing that. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was just saying for the other questions, we have Matt and Yamal. If if you guys just want to ask those verbally.
This is Yamil with the AJC. Hi. I think you answered my question. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for being here. That was great.
Happy
Thank
to
you
do
so
it.
much.
Okay, and Matt has a question too. I'm just
definitely. This is Matt with the USA Today. Thank you for being here as well. I was just curious about a little bit of circling back to the beginning of our conversation.
Sure.
How do you think creatively when you're thinking through, okay, what would I need to prove this story? Like, what are documents? What are the sources? Who are the people who I could get?
right.
That's not necessarily always the way, though, that you can prove an investigative piece. And how do you think going about like how do you know what you don't know, I guess?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. How do you know what you don't know? A corollary to that question, Matt, is who knows what you don't know? Who knows it? Is anybody keeping records about this? Is anybody gathering data about this? Are there any organizations that have a vested stake in monitoring this? Do they produce any reports? Can you find people who work there? So it's rather than focusing on who the sources might be, focus first on who knows this stuff. Who knows what you need to know? Going back to my Polish journalist's, impossible story, who knew whether those mutual fund managers were being bribed or not? They did, and whoever might be bribing them knew, and that was it. So you can sort of get a clue for how findable a story is when you start thinking about who knows this, who has a vested stake in keeping track of this. It might be through an official record keeping process, right? It might be that there's some agency you're not aware of, some state or nonprofit group that monitors this on a regular basis, or it may be just some advocacy group that has a stake in that issue and will be keeping track of what is known. And in terms of how do you know what you don't know, I don't know about you, Matt, but that's one of the best questions I ever put to sources when I'm doing an interview. What do I need to know to understand this? Which is always saying, what don't I know yet that I need to know to understand this? And let me just say, you all have these skills. You would not be where you are if you didn't have that skill, if you didn't know how to pull information out of people. So you know how to do it. You just need to think, I think, a little bit more conceptually about what you're doing while you're doing it. Okay, now I am verifying what I will need to know, what I'm trying to itemize the things that I'm going to have to learn to prove this story. And that may help you be a little bit more systematic about questioning people on that. Let's see, we have Danielle has a question here too. Investigative stories related to government accountability. It can be in the weeds, a policy nuance. What's your best advice for storytelling that doesn't necessarily have human characters or stories? Well, if it doesn't have some sort of human impact, you're going to flunk the so what question in my process, aren't you? So there is a human impact in those stories that you just haven't seen yet. So maybe post workshop here, you will rethink. There is no policy nuance that doesn't affect somebody. There's no policy in the that's being practiced by people or organizations that have power over us that doesn't affect us. So you just need to turn the prism until you can see through it to what the human impacts of it are. And if you can't, do some more reporting, because until you can say why people should care, then you haven't found what the story is yet. Now I understand when you're talking about incremental stories about the policy is here, they want to change it in this direction, these guys want to change it in that direction. That can get a little hard, but it's still there. If you change it in this direction, you're going to affect people in one way. If you change it in that, you're going to affect them in another way. So the human impact will still be there. Okay, am I missing something?
I think that's all the questions. One from Lisi.
Lisi, why don't you go ahead and.
Sorry, trying to unmute myself.
Sure.
Okay, so I've been covering this healthcare fraud that has resulted in about $1.5 billion in federal fraud, and actually most of it was involving TRICARE, which again is targeting the military.
Yeah.
And so most of the key players have already been they either pleaded guilty or went to trial and are in prison now. But, I know that there's still a lot more that hasn't been uncovered in this yet. And, including for a fact that I know one very, very well-known professional athlete in the NFL was a part owner in one of these, or maybe a few of the companies that were involved in this. And I know that, I'm sure there are other people like him who are involved in this. And it just seems like it's a deep, deep rabbit hole, but it needs to.
Yeah. I see your problem.
Find the rabbit.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that a lot of rabbits have already been snared, right?
Yeah.
And there's still some running loose. And so the balance becomes, is it worth your time to pursue those rabbits or to find a completely fresh rabbit hole with a completely fresh project that could, and again, there is a law of diminishing returns, obviously. At some point, as I said, as Alan Abelson would tell you, once you've shot them and hung them and stabbed them, you don't have to drown them and poison them too. So if you have fully mined this area, then it might be that it is time to set it down and look for something fresh to work on. But another possibility is to get back to that idea that I was wrestling with in my own efforts to cut my project thesis. Why did it happen? Why did this fraud unfold? And what has been done to keep it from happening again? Those are always really good questions to ask when you wonder whether you've reached the point of diminishing returns. If you've answered it already in the course of carrying out your investigative work, then great. If you haven't, then it might be the way to sweep up a lot of things like, well, maybe one reason it happened is it had celebrity glitter sprinkled all over it. Maybe that was why it happened and why it didn't happen, why it wasn't uncovered. What has been done to keep it from happening? Are they checking companies like the one this athlete is attending with? Is there any barrier to prevent this from happening again? So if you've asked those two questions and answered them, then you're ready to move on. But if you haven't, maybe that's a way to get into whether or not there's one more step, one more piece that you can, one more bite you can take of that apple, as editors like to say.
Yeah, I think I haven't really answered that question. So that's really a good direction. So thank you very much.
Welcome. Other questions?
I have a question about when to publish, and I'll give you an example of something that we're doing. We've seen a spike in fatal police encounters in our community, and we're exploring that, but we're also trying to put it into the broadest context as we can. And the debate that my editor, we go back and forth on this all the time, is should we wait until we have the goods for a quote unquote traditional like 5-part newspaper series? We're an online outlet.
Okay.
So, we've done, multi-part series where we publish day after day after day.
Sure.
Or do we do more of like a rolling thunder sort of investigation where you publish maybe one story now and then another story when you get the next batch of information, and you just keep doing it and you sort of drill down over the course of, say, 6 months to a year? I was wondering, do you have any thoughts about what you find to be more effective?
I do have some thoughts on that. Yes. And it's this, my personal preference in terms of building impact is to start out with a big bang, to start out with a big story, not necessarily your 5-part, all known thought about the problem, but a big story that attracts attention. And then shift into rolling thunder mode, because tips will roll in. You will learn more about your story after you publish it than you did before you published it. That seems counterintuitive, but the fact is you do learn more about the story after it's been published. So the strategy that, looking back, and it wasn't a conscious strategy, but looking back for me on the stories that produced the richest return in terms of impact, expanding people's knowledge about how something worked, getting into the really deep human issues, was that approach. The Captive Clientele series started with a 2-part series, back-to-back days, just blew the story onto the front page. And then over the next year, I did nearly 24 follow-up stories. And some of them, like the one about the Air Force efforts, had huge after effects, aftershocks. So think of a big quake and the aftershocks. And I think that's a good strategy. The 5-part series, after which you walk away from a problem like over-aggressive policing, troubles me a little bit. And you can see why. The problem isn't going to go away. We've had too much evidence of that. It is a problem that's going to require constant vigilance from journalists. So don't set yourself up to say, okay, now we've told you everything we know about this process and we're moving on. Rather, set yourself up to say, big problem, bam, slam the cymbals, and then keep at it, so that eternal vigilance starts to sink into the community's mind. They're watching. They're going to keep watching for this. And this is necessary in things like child protective services. This is necessary in things like, the Me Too problems in workplace situations. Do not back yourself into a corner where you say, okay, did that 5-part series, page 1, great, moving on now. For chronic problems like that, we need the constant vigilance of a big impact, and then continuing coverage. Does that help? Now that's just my bias. Don't go and say my editor. Don't say Diana Henriques said you're absolutely wrong to your editor. But that's my thought.
That's great. I mean, because we go back and forth all the time on this in terms of, depending on the story. So thank you very much. I really
and you can see that the topic of the story would change that calculus. If we're talking about a corporate scandal, I mean, if we're talking, for example, about the ignition malfunction at Ford, or you're talking about the 737 MAX design problems at Boeing, that's a discrete story. You slam into that and you get down to the bottom of it, and then you can move on with the occasional look back to see how things are going. But for chronic systemic issues that society deals with, I think it's just wrongheaded to pretend like you can swoop in, do the all-known thought story, and then move on.
So Nick, is the editor on this John C. Hill? Because if it is, you can tell him he's wrong. Tell him Diana said you're wrong.
Yeah, John is working with me on some of this.
Okay. All right. One time for one final question. Does anybody have one? Okay. So Diana, I want to thank you very much. Diana, it's a great time, great talk and great questions. I'm glad we were able to keep you on a little bit extra.
I was delighted to stay, and I just want to reemphasize, Chris knows how to reach me. I might not get back to you right away. I am working on a new book. Quick time to blurb the new book. Okay, I'm doing a new book on the origins of Wall Street regulation, the birth of the SEC under the New Deal with FDR. So I'm having a huge amount of fun with that. But it sometimes means I may not get right back to you right away, but I will get back to you if you have questions. Okay, thanks for having me.